Hello, everyone. Thank you again for the organizers at PSSC for the invitation and to join you in this wonderful process of learning again about ethics and research. I'm Alejandria, and this afternoon, my role is to discuss with you about the implications of ethics in our conduct of research. Now, in the previous discussions, you've already been informed about some of the backgrounds on why we even had research ethics as part of our processes in conducting research, from the problematic example of the Stanford University issue to other declarations that came about while doing research. Now, just some recap. We've been discussing about the four pillars of research ethics, which are beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and autonomy. So those four parts are very crucial when you evaluate research protocols, and they're very crucial as well when you create your own proposals. Now, you've also been acquainted, or there has already been a discussion of the types of informed consent forms that you should be expecting from research protocols. One is that of assent, and the other one is of consent. This is a sample of how to identify when is it to have consent or when is it time to have assent. So this has also been discussed with you early on. Now, there is also this concept of renewing consent. And what do we mean again by this? It means that subjects could also be informed of new findings that may influence their continued participation in the research. This implies that if there are some changes in your research protocol because of recent findings in the field or by other researchers, and you know that this will impact the participation of your key informants or your participants in your study, you have to inform them and go through a process of securing their consent again. Now, when is consent not needed? This is just a recap. It's always needed unless it is waived. So the level of consent requirement varies per project. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that your colleague's project is undergoing a complete or a stringent research ethics clearance, and so you will have to go through that as well. It depends on the study that you're making. Why? Because every research has its own extent of risks and benefits that it may pose on participants of the study. Hence, the consent can also shift from one project to another. Now, let's look at this example. Look at here. It says here, a study on the experiences of a civil society organization during the pandemic versus a study on the experiences of a member of a civil society organization during a pandemic. Which do you think will require extensive consent? I'll give you 5 seconds to think about that. Which would require consent? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What are your answers? Please type A if your answer is the first option, which is a study on the experiences of a civil society organization during the pandemic. Type B in the chat box if your answer is a study on the experiences of a member of a civil society organization during the pandemic. Let's go. Type your answers. Okay, so if you've typed A, a study on the experiences of a civil society organization during a pandemic, then you are a little bit off. Why? Because the answer should be B, a study on the experiences of a member of a civil society organization during a pandemic. Why? Because B is centered on the experiences of an individual. You will be gathering the personal narratives of a person, as opposed to option A, wherein you are gathering the narratives of an organization. Okay? So the vulnerability context, the risks is higher or are higher for study B, because you're talking about the lived experiences of a person, as opposed to A, wherein you are just documenting the experiences of an organization. Okay? So here, typically, consent will be required, or a stringent following of requiring consent will be with study B as opposed to study A. Of course, consent will also be requested for A in terms of when you already interview the participant who is the representative of the organization, you're going to ask, for example, can I record the conversation and such things. But in terms of seeking the consent of the individual to narrate a story, that one would fall under option B. Okay, so we see the difference, right? If it's organizational, the consent may not be as seeking consent may not be as stringent as opposed to option option B. Okay, all right, let's move on. Okay, so this is actually the meat of the matter, for me at least. This is where my talk will center. So we have to discuss about research methods and ethical considerations. How can methods define our ethics protocol? As a person who has sat in several deliberations of clearances for research protocols, this is a key point of discussion among panel members. We would often ask ourselves, can methodology really affect ethics? And the answer to that is yes. A solid understanding of the science behind your method will allow you to devise a more ethically rigorous protocol. Okay, so we're going to discuss several types of methods and design today, and the ethical considerations that you must have when you design this. Okay, so this is quite text heavy, and you'll have to forgive me for that, but it's necessary for us to identify all of this to help you as you prepare your manuscripts, and at the same time as you sit as a panel member for your own research ethics committee. So we have several methods here. It's not exhaustive, but I've targeted 4 key methods that we typically implement. So we have 4 methods here, and there are several markers of risks here. So let's start with survey. You can see that here, survey presents several risks as well to the participants. The first one is representation. This is a key issue that we face when we do surveys, right? Like, how do we ensure that we have provided enough space for everyone to be represented? So here, the inclusion criteria will be very critical for you to evaluate. Are people who are marginalized, are people who are often voiceless included in this study? Or if not, is their non-participation justified accordingly? Next is that of restrictive questions. So there are sometimes we devise a survey instrument wherein there is a non-skip protocol, and this becomes very restrictive. And sometimes this also poses ethical concerns, because if the person is unwilling to answer that part, they cannot skip it because you did not allow them to, you did not provide them a margin to skip it. So restrictive questions must be justified accordingly. And as much as possible, I think it would be really important that we provide other options for restrictive questions. Next is that of group consent. Now, this is a very touchy topic, especially if you're doing a survey among groups with shared identities. So group consent, when we secure group consent, how do we really identify the representative voices? Because the problem with group consent is that there is the assumption that everyone is in agreement, when in fact there are dissident voices or non-conforming voices to a group. How do we record those non-conforming voices? So another point we have to consider with surveys. And of course, data privacy. When we do subset analysis, and this has been discussed already intensively by the past module. And then again, overstating significance of participation. Now, this is something that is I think is a common issue with some data collectors, wherein out of the need to reach a quota, they would overstate the significance of a person's participation in the survey. Like, if you participate in our survey, it would help in policy implication. And the thing is that not all surveys would really have impact on policy. That is the hope, but that is not an assured future. So to overstate things like that is another form of risk. Now let's move on to focus group discussion. We're still together, right? So for those of you who are doing surveys, maybe now is at this point you're thinking, aha, so I think I have to refine some parts of my protocol. Or if you have advised students, I think most of us have done that, right? Advised students for their thesis or their dissertations. I think at this point, we are more aware of how to frame the benefits and risks statements in our own proposals. Now, the focus group discussion. As a qualitative researcher, my expertise or my specialization would be using the latter three methods of this discussion. So, so for focus group discussion, anyone here who does focus group discussion? Can you type it on the chat box? Okay. No, actually, I'm more interested to know how many of you are qualitative researchers and quantitative researchers. Can we have a brief check on that? Brief temp check on that. How many are qualitative? How many are quantitative? And can I see, or maybe mixed method? Can you please type it on chat box? Okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. I think a lot more people are actually exploring qualitative research nowadays, primarily because it, well, at least with some of my anecdotal conversations with people, they're saying that they are trying to shift to qualitative research because they want to understand more about the in-depth reasons, in-depth aspirations of people. So maybe that's just one segment of the population. But anyway, so thank you for participating in that. So with focus group discussion, what are the key issues that we might face? Just like in survey, wherein group consent becomes problematic, here representation is also problematic in terms of group speak. So let's say we're having a focus group discussion, right? And then what happens is that one person becomes vocal about a topic and then shares this and that and shares it so articulately. And then the tendency at times would be for the other members of the group to say, to just agree to that, because, there's the idea that this person is so articulate and this person has said it very well, and it's hard to disagree because the other person may not have had a more articulate way of disagreeing. So they just remain silent. And somehow it appears to the researcher that everyone is agreeing because no one is deliberately disagreeing to that statement. So the researcher writes down that the group thinks that blah, blah, blah. So it becomes a group speak without really underscoring the dissent in the group, right? And there's also this context of power dynamics. That's why it's very important that when you do FGDs, you balance the members of the FGD. If you, for example, put in more men than women in the FGD, and in the society, men have control of a lot of processes in society, you would notice that women will not necessarily provide a lot more input. So what do you do in that situation? Anyone? Please type in your answer. What do you do in a situation like that? You provide a balanced participation. Sure, that could be option number one. Option number two is that you secure, as the facilitator of the FGD, you will secure you will ensure that women will have space to talk. So you need to have that balancing equation. And so when you devise your protocol, it must be stated there that understanding that there is some power dynamics, gender-based power dynamics in the society. During FGDs, questions that will the facilitator will ensure that the disadvantaged members will have time to discuss their opinions apart from what is given to the group. So that could somehow balance this issue of power dynamics. And then the next thing is that a right to withdrawal of protocol, right to withdrawal from the protocol. So especially among Filipinos, it's hard to withdraw when you're already into something, right? Because we have this very strong notion of hiya, right? And pakikisama. So what happens is that what you could how do you ensure that the person will be comfortable enough to say, hang on, I don't like to be part of this research anymore. So you have to include that in your protocol, the culturally sensitive ways that could allow a person to withdraw from your protocol. I cannot provide a good example right now because every society, every group is different, but what is important is that as a researcher, you know your field site better, so you would know the better ways to ensure that they are comfortable to withdraw from your own research. Next is that of cultural prescriptions. This would relate a lot about how certain ideas are understood within a society. So here again, the researcher must be aware of the cultural generally the culture of that society, what are required in that society and such, so that during the FGD, for example, are you supposed to put men and women in an FGD in a highly in a society that strictly follows Islamic culture? The answer is no, right? So you have to separately speak with them. So those kinds of cultural prescriptions. And then, of course, data privacy, right? Now, this is very tricky to do in Filipino setting, right? You put them together, you discuss something, you kind of know that when they get out of that FGD, parts of the FGD might be discussed as part of community talk or gossip. And so this is something that you have to develop keenly. And again, this is culturally relative. How are you going to secure that data privacy is not breached about the conversation that happened? Next, we move to key informant interviews. So with key informant interviews, we have, now this is a whole lot trickier, primarily because there are some very personal questions that you might ask that might trigger a lot of past trauma and such things on the person. So first thing is that of PTSD, psychosocial impact of the interview. So when you interview a person, is your protocol able to provide support to this person should some questions of yours bring some psychosocial impact to that person? It's not enough that you would say, okay, so if a person gets some PTSD context, I will tell them to seek support. It's not enough anymore to do that. So you have to literally provide the participant a list of wellness sources, networks that this person can access. If you have sufficient funding, perhaps you could offer psychosocial support as well through an intervention. And this is something that we've implemented in our mental health study. When we were doing a mental health study among the youth in the Philippines, this is something that we've ensured. Since we had funding and we have collaborations, what we did is that as part of our informed consent, we said that after the interview or during the interview, if you feel that the questions are bringing you to anxiety and such, please know that services will be made available for you, counseling, therapy, and such, or other linkages. So it's very important that these are actionable terms, not vague conditions. And then, of course, representation is a key issue here. How do you ensure that the person that you are interviewing is the best person to interview about this topic? Usually we follow the rule of the thumb of key informant, right? That's why it's called key informant interview. This is the person who has the most knowledge, most experience about the topic that you are studying. Next is that of the economic impact of the interview. You want to interview the person, but this person is also working, and by that, you are going to affect the livelihood of this person. How do you mitigate that? This is where this issue about remuneration comes in. Is it okay that I pay my key informant to participate in a study? Of course not. You don't pay your participant to join a study. What you do, though, is to reimburse the time or the income lost for the time that they participated in your study. For example, your study would really affect the time that they are working, and there is no other time option for both of you to meet. So what do? You could compute for the income that they would lose, let's say 500 pesos per day. So you would base your remuneration package, if I can say it as that, based on their lost income. Again, there's power dynamics. It's hard if you're going to interview, for example, you're the teacher, and then you're going to interview your students about your teaching or about their school or about anything related to the relationship that you're having. That is a problematic situation. How do you resolve that? you don't study your students. You could probably study a similar group of people that you don't have power over. In the same way that perhaps doing a study about your own patients may be a bit tricky. So you have to really devise mechanisms by which your power, your positionality as a person in power will not affect the way that they respond to this. Perhaps you could have somebody else to interview these participants, not you. Okay. And then, of course, the non-traceability of narratives. This is quite difficult. Why? Because here, when you do qualitative research, a key issue is that you tell their stories, right? But the problem is, how do you tell their stories without them being traced by other people and say, hang on, I know this person, I know this story, this must be this person. So this is a very tricky part of doing key informant interviews. Some people would do anonymization. They change the name, but sometimes it's not enough. So they also change the name of the place, or they kind of cluster the place. For example, you did a study in Manila, you would study in National Capital Region. So it gives that sense of vagueness that will help in the non-traceability of narratives. Another one is the non-validation of narrative analysis. So this is a key point of disagreement for some doing qualitative research. How do you validate the analysis of the narrative? The best course of action is, once you're done doing the analysis of the narrative, you can actually present it to the participant and say, this is how I saw our conversation. Am I in the right context here? And this person could validate it or not. And you could have your action points from that. And then, of course, participant observation. Here, a key point here would be the psychosocial impacts of being watched and of watching. Now, when a person is informed that they're being watched, of course, they might behave differently. And in this process of behaving differently, one could expect that it also affects them psychosocially. Imagine you're being watched 24/7 by this stranger who will write about your life. That itself will cause stress on a person. And when they try to put their best behavior, that also causes stress, because imagine doing that for quite a while. And trust me, when ethnographers do participant observation, that is quite a while, 6 months to a year of doing that. So that's gonna take a toll on the observed. And then, of course, privacy and anonymity. How do you secure the privacy of the person that you're observing, right? So there should be more boundaries that you would set in your protocol. For example, you might say that I would observe only up until this extent and leave other activities unobserved or undocumented, to provide some sense of privacy to the participant. There is also this very interesting question about consent. Once you tell a person that you're observing them, there is the expectation that their behavior will change, right? So some researchers would tend to think that I'd probably just not seek their consent. Maybe that's the best thing to do. Do not seek consent. I'll just do it covert. And this is a very risky and most often unethical way of doing participant observation. Okay? People will need to give their consent for you to document their lives, to document their behaviors, to document their life ways. Okay? And again, the bias in observation is also something you have to worry about. Why? Because when you observe, your mental space could be already directed towards several certain habits, because that's part of your worldview. And so when you look at things, you only see the things that are within your worldview. So you already have a bias while you observe. So you have to put, so one way to address this is to create observation points. Like, what are the things I'd like to observe? So that could mitigate this issue. And of course, there is a strong context against participating in illegal activity. As a researcher, you are not supposed to participate in illegal activity. So do not engage in it. Now, what do you do if you observe something illegal? And do you report to the police? Do you keep it to yourself? When a person is going to be in danger, when a group of people will be in danger, and you know of this, this is something that you have to report to authorities. And I know it might sound problematic, because you're supposedly the observer, the scientific observer, just watching it. But when persons are about to be put in harm's way, you have to report to authorities. But trust me when I say that this is a polarized topic, because other groups are also saying that you don't intervene because this is a societal process and you're just there, a scientist, you cannot intervene. So now it depends on you, your institution, and such context to determine if you're allowed to participate or to witness such events. Okay. Now, these are some of the ethical dilemmas in research design that we also have to cover. So there is the scope and crisis of representation. So you have to be very mindful of these items when you design your protocol: age, gender, geography. For example, are you inclusive of geographically isolated, disadvantaged areas? Ethnic background. Now, let me discuss this a bit, okay? The thing is, you need to be wary about, or you need to at least be aware that you cannot just do indigenous people studies in the Philippines, okay? Because we do follow the IPRA law of 1997, right? And that law states that before you engage in any research or development activity with the indigenous population, you have to secure the approval or clearance from NCIP. Okay, what's that? The National Commission for Indigenous People. So how do you go about that? So the thing is, the reality is that it takes quite a while for NCIP to provide clearance for indigenous population studies, okay? So what do you do? As a research advisor for students, maybe you should start applying for the NCIP probably 6 months to a year before the actual intended fieldwork, okay? Also in your case, a year would be a good time space for the clearance process. So what happens there? You have your research protocol, right? You have your research protocol. It has gone through the research committee already. Before the research committee gives you the actual approval, it needs to have the clearance from the NCIP. That's a protocol, okay? That's not a made up context. FREB has a memorandum on this together with NCIP, that before the ethics committee gives you the go signal to do the research or the approval clearance, research ethics clearance, you have to secure the NCIP clearance. So the NCIP clearance happens, probably you should process this really a year before. So what do you do with the NCIP? You have your research protocol, you have they have this in their website. Please do search about it. I cannot cover the entire thing, but you have to prepare this, and then and submit it to the regional office of NCIP. Now, NCIP regional office will convene its own kind of ethics committee, and then they will process your application. And so there will also be community gathering wherein that you will secure the consent of the community. So it depends per indigenous population. For example, a colleague of mine who is doing studies on medicinal plants among an indigenous population in northern Philippines, they would even have kanyao, or more like a sacred gathering wherein they slaughter a pig for for um, for a discussion with the community about the research process. So it depends per culture, okay, per group of people. So after you secure the community's approval, then it would go through the NCIP board, and then they would give you the clearance. Of course, there are payments related to this. Please do check NCIP if you're into indigenous population research. So there. Again, socioeconomic status would be very critical when you develop your research protocol. Always, if you're doing surveys, always rely on the socioeconomic or socio-demographic characteristics of the Philippines when you try to do your calculations for representation. Now, for the vulnerable population, it's very important that you do not reify stereotypes, okay? In your own protocol, be mindful of the semantics that you use, the language that you use. For example, do you still say sex workers? Of course not. Or do you still say disabled people? Of course not. So it's very important for you to use correct terminology so that at the onset you are already cutting the stereotypes on vulnerable members of society. And then you also have to understand, are these people, do they have the capacity for autonomy? Are they dependent on me or my institution so that they cannot say no to when I ask them for participation in my study? Power dynamics, capacity to withdraw, which I've discussed earlier. Then sensitive research. So there is this context of conflict of interest. How do you respond to crimes, which I've discussed earlier? Do you participate in them? Do you witness this? How do you respond to this? Psychosocial impact on participant and the researcher. Okay, now this is something that is very critical. Okay, most of the time when we do our protocol, we only say this is how I'm going to mitigate the risk of the psychosocial impact on the participant. In today's protocol design, you also need to write how are you going to mitigate the potential risk on the psychosocial condition of the researcher if you're doing a sensitive study. Okay, so a lot of ethics committees are now looking for clauses on how to mitigate impacts on psychosocial impacts on the researcher to keep the researcher safe as well. And then how do you exit that kind of relationship? So you studied children in prostitution, you studied them. How do you exit that relationship? So after you collected their narratives, you just say, okay, thank you, bye, I'm going to write about this. There is now a need for you to create a clause on how you are going to exit that relationship. Of course, it depends per study, and you will be the better person to identify what would be a critical action on your side. This does not mean that you're going to save your key informants. This just means that you have to provide an ethically sound exit protocol for your research. And then data analysis and presentation. Accuracy in retelling narratives. Sometimes we want to make our narratives sound more appealing than they are, so we kind of put some flavor into it. That is highly unethical. So we have to be accurate in the way we retell narratives. And to do that, we also need to make our key informants participate in the validation of how we analyze their narratives. Privacy, this has been discussed, extent of engagement of the participant. Up until when are the participants engaged? How do you secure their actual participation in the research? Okay, so these are key points that you could consider when you design your protocol or when you evaluate the protocol. Now, these are just some sample contexts we're in here. For example, Tom was conducting a qualitative research on suicidal ideation among members of an indigenous population. After staying in the field for a few months, he realized that suicide as a concept does not even exist in the community. However, to support his theoretical leaning, what did he do? He decided to alter some statements of his key informants to hit on suicidality. His argument is that he did not fabricate the data and the person. Instead, he just paraphrased their statements to highlight some ideas. Is this ethical or not? Type in your answers. You're right, it's not. It's problematic, and this should fail an ethical clearance application. Okay, so research misconduct could be anything between fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, covert, covert researches, and misconduct, any form of misconduct that researchers devise that would severely affect the community. Now, what are the implications of this? Your paper could be retracted. There could be cases filed against you, and a whole lot more. Your degree could be withdrawn. So these are some of the potential recourse that institutions can make against people who conduct unethical research. Deception studies are also problematic and can cause a lot of cases, can cause a lot of retractions as well. Now, let me go to, you've discussed risk a while ago. Let me go to this, your activity, okay? So using the research protocol that you are seeing right now, let me move. Okay, so using the research protocol that you are seeing right now, you'll be divided into groups, and what you're going to do is that you will discuss with your group mates the potential methods risks from this study, the potential design ethics challenges. You also have to classify the level of risk. Is this minimal, medium, and or highly risky? And then what are the points for mitigation for those risks? Okay, we're good. All right, thank you very much everyone for listening and participating well in this discussion. Now we are going to have the question and answer, and then after that, we're moving on to your group work. Thank you.